Mondays with Mike. Today, rather a special video because we're going to talk about modern monetary theory, whether it is true, whether it can be publicly believed to the benefit or detriment of society, because a lot of our discussion involves what should the government do, what should it spend on, what should it tax, who should it tax, and in what proportion, to whom should it give tax breaks, subsidies, graft. It's not really graft. And modern monetary theory is helpful as a context to think about this in. So, what is modern monetary theory? For this, if you want a better explanation of it, a link is on the website, and I get my information on what it is from that video. And I'll describe it briefly, Mike, and then you can note if I've left anything off. So, there's this orthodox idea of how money came about. And it strikes me as very similar to the idea that John Locke puts forth of, in the state of nature, people were agreeable with each other, there were problems with living in a state of nature, so they came together and they wanted a social contract, and that's how we got government, kids. Being familiar with that myth gives us common ideas, common dreams, if you will, common frameworks for which to evaluate things. But that's not actually how our current society or government came about. If you want to know how that happened, you need to look at feudalism and the Black Death. Here's the little fable of how money came about. Robinson Crusoe knows how to grow grain, and Friday knows how to fish, so they barter. But barter is inconvenient because it requires a double coincidence of wants. So they start with seashells, but eventually they go with gold as a transaction medium because gold is rare and it doesn't decay, or precious metals or whatever. But holding gold bears its own problems. People might try to steal it. It might be inconvenient or in non-standard pieces. So you store it with a goldsmith, and the goldsmith can make it into ingots, and he can also give you a receipt, like you have this many ingots, and we know it's pure because I purified it, and so that's the first bank. And the goldsmith gives you a receipt, and the receipt is lighter than the gold, and so people just carry around those receipts and trade them, and that's paper money. And then the goldsmith realizes everybody wants to keep their gold with him, and so he doesn't actually have to keep all the gold on hand, and he can use most of it, say 80-90% of it, and just keep a 10-20% reserve in case somebody comes around, and that's the invention of fractional reserve banking. But as with a lot of academic disciplines that tell you the history of things, the disciplines didn't have the information when it initially emerged. They worked with a broken story, and they used their own kind of archaeology or fact-finding. And he says, no, it came about because of the issuance of government debt. The government saying, I owe you this much. And they hand you a piece of paper, and that's how it came about. I think I've given enough history here. Would you say that I have missed any key part of the history there?
No, I think you're explaining the fable of the origin of money. I understand it. I understand what you're saying.
The implication of all this is, if you issue money, people say if you issue too much money, then you will get inflation. And indeed you might. But, he says, the American colonies already came up with a solution for this. When they would issue the paper script, they would put in place a new tax in order to collect the money back. So all of this evolved together, and gradually people at various times in history, whether it's during World War II or the financial crisis, realized, oh wait, we don't have taxes so we collect money so that we have money to spend. Obviously not, because here's the printing press or here's the computer, and we can bring the money into existence. Taxes are a means of controlling inflation, not a means of raising revenue. The revenue is raised by we make the money. So if you have too much inflation, you can do various things to bring the money back so that you decrease the supply of money and decrease the inflation, and that is the function of taxation. So now we get into the idea, is modern monetary theory true? If true, is widespread belief in it dangerous, which might translate to policymakers believe in it but many in the public don't, and then the public acts according to the non-belief? Or alternatively, if modern monetary theory is true, can a change of mind, at least among policymakers, led by America and probably the world, lead to a new green age of prosperity, activity, progress, and splendor? What do you think, Mike?
Giving it some thought, my answers are kind of no and no. So for the kind of part, it's true in the sense it could work maybe once, that there's a window of time where the value of the money would be such that a government could issue its own currency, pay off a significant amount of debt, and the value, the faith that people hold in the money, there would be a lag time between how much it's worth and then how much it appreciates in value. And so the issue with the theory is that while it may be true in a sort of ideal, perfect scenario, the exercise of any kind of policy action or implication doesn't exist in a vacuum. The kind of currency that we're talking about and how people interact in an economy has political ramifications that extend beyond the value of money. And that's, I think, where the flaw is within the theory. Is that yes, it's true that if a government has a fiat currency and they can issue the value of that currency, they could absolutely never get into debt one time. But because it's a trust based system, they may become isolated, right? So, what that means is that people may just move away from using their currency, and that the system that we have is heavily based on an agreement between different entities that use the currency that the value will be stable enough for it to be used. And that, I think, is where there is a flaw in the theory of monetary modern policy, that it deals in absolutes, and you can't deal with it in absolutes when you're talking about human interaction, that there's a degree of ambiguity and a level of unpredictability. Actually, Obama was the one who mentioned this when he was talking about how the US government could just mint $1 trillion coins and deposit them in the treasury. And they could do that, but that there were very serious risks to doing that, which is why they didn't ultimately decide on that policy approach to address the issues that were occurring. And so, yeah, if we only had one currency that, how do I explain? There was only one currency, period, in existence. If there was only one government, then yeah, absolutely. It could never go bankrupt. It could issue its own currency and it would be the only one that worked. The problem is we live in a world of competing currencies and competing issuers, which means that something could happen, that what we saw with the implementation of the trade tariffs is that all the other holders of the debt of the currency that influence the value and the trust in the currency could jump ship and they could say no, no more, and they'll just move to something else. And if they do that, then while it is true that the government could forever really pay off its own debts, it's not so clear that it would ever be able to issue any kind of new debt to anyone, because when somebody bought something, it was the implicit understanding that the value of what they bought, for instance, a bond, would hold at that value. If you were to suddenly rapidly introduce a huge amount of money, I'm talking trillions of dollars, if the US were to just wave a wand and pay off all the debt at once, it would work one time, right? But then it would lead to a complete, I think, collapse of trust in the system. And so that's why I think it is flawed. Where there's some wiggle room is that they don't have to pay it off all at once. They could just introduce little amounts into the system, just enough to stay ahead of the curve. But I do think that a bit of a fiction that's spun, at least in the United States and any country that holds just huge amounts of debt, that they can't operate with high deficits, they're choosing to operate with high deficits for political reasons because it creates a sort of leverage that allows for more effective control of the population, especially in democratic societies. But he did make that distinction pretty clear in the video. I listened to the whole thing that the big issue of viewing the world in the language of can't, of not being able to do things, is that it creates political cowardice, uncertainty, so that we don't make investments in huge capital expenditures that we need. So the example I think of is the interconnected highway system of Eisenhower's vision that we had to have it. And so he moved heaven and earth to make it happen. And the parallel that was introduced in the video was talking about China and how if you go to China, they've got really fast trains, they've got huge airports, they've developed just a huge amount of infrastructure. And it's because China, when they say they're going to do something, they just do it. And the United States and some of these other countries that carry a large debt, there's a lot of vacillating, a lot of debate and contention over should we raise the debt ceiling, shouldn't we raise the debt ceiling, if we raise the debt ceiling, how much do we raise the debt ceiling? And what it's become is this sort of instrument by opposition parties, which is what we saw with the Republicans every time they threatened a government shutdown. I mean, the Democrats too have threatened it, but the Republicans are the ones who followed through. They actually did a government shutdown a few times. Is it's used as a sort of political football. Like we're not going to deal with the problems because not dealing with the problems is politically convenient because then you can point and say, oh, there's a problem. If you ever actually address the issues of the day in any significant, meaningful way, then you no longer can run on there being issues. You actually have to, govern and meaningfully improve people's lives. The whole issue, the argument can be made for tax cuts is that, oh, taxes are too high, so we need to incentivize economic stimulus and et cetera, motivate to work harder. The only reason they can do that, and he does, I think in the video, he does make a great point that the government, if they really wanted to, can 100% provide full employment to anyone who wants it because they can operate at an extreme loss. And we've talked about this before. I think that part is true, that if they really wanted to, they could hire anybody. And the main reason that it doesn't happen is for political reasons, to point out the lazy people in society, or to say, oh, there's people who don't want to work, so we got to impose all these requirements on any of our welfare programs, or we got to. Do you remember in the 90s, there was a discussion about the Cadillac? I'm trying to remember the term of people on welfare who had, it was used as like a way to denigrate people on welfare.
Cadillac, was it the contention that people had fancy cars but squalid houses?
A welfare queen. No, it was.
Oh, yes, I remember that. Not from the time, but retrospectively.
Yeah, but of people who were living large on the largesse of welfare, of all the different social programs. So they had to do serious austerity and serious cuts, which happened during the Clinton administration, where they did impose certain welfare requirements. They dramatically changed the war on poverty programs. They did in fact make some of those changes. The whole point here, I think it's true, kind of, for modern munching. There's certain assumptions built into it, but that it's also flawed from the outset because of the problem with one of the assumptions that's made is that the strength of the currency only exists on the part of the issuer. And I, I think part of the reason why I'm skeptical of it is that it's so untested, right? That of the few times in history where it's been tried, it failed dramatically. From my understanding of political science and study of history, I do think it's possible for debt to be paid off in this way, but there's a window of opportunity pretty much because the moment anybody actually loses faith that the value of whatever they paid for in terms of bonds, for instance, by buying up debt from a country is rapidly diminished, everybody jumps ship, right? Why would you park your money in an asset that just lost its value by half or more? Part of the reason people like something like gold is that there's a finite amount. But if somebody went out there into the universe and found some asteroid full of gold that vastly exceeded the supply of gold in the whole world, and then showed up on planet Earth with massive amounts of gold, the value of the gold would probably diminish. It's because of the fact that there is an actual limit that we know of. And the whole issue with fiat currency is that technically there is no limit. It's only as much as a government decides the limit of the supply to be.
Okay. Yeah, I think you've synthesized different ideas to give modern monetary context and to describe it as technically true, and it would probably work once or maybe like once in a great while, but that it wouldn't work routinely. And I suppose that whenever somebody shows up and tries to explain away everything with a few simple principles.
There is no magic wand, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
That if you think of the way the world works now, the systems we have and the tools we have available are only a product of a lot of trial and error. That lots of
Mm-hmm.
governments had to fail before societies found some that work well enough that we keep them around. That there have been a lot of attempts to control various facets of human society in various ways. Look at Roman history if you really want an
Yeah.
understanding of just how completely ridiculous some of the attempts have been. There's a long list of efforts that were made that didn't pan out.
Yeah, so there's trust that underlies a currency and even a fiat currency, and that trust is that the issuer will keep the currency somewhat finite. Because if those who buy bonds, the bonds are tied up, if the currency becomes substantially worth less, then those bond issuers have got burned, and there's empirical evidence that that issuer is going to burn its bond buyers, and so it's not going to have other bond buyers. So if what the professor is, if he's correct that, oh, you can issue bonds as a means of clamping inflation, not if people won't buy the bonds. If they won't buy the bonds, then it won't work. And given the world that we live in, where people can watch these things happening in real time, you're right. They can move their money, they can sell dollars and move it to a different kind of money. So it'll work once in a while and there's a lag, but it's not something we can routinely do. Okay, sounds good. Now, my next question would be, therefore, does it not seem that we have to strive, at least in the long run, for some kind of balanced budget?
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. The reason for why we should strive for something like that is to create better political opportunities. If you
Mm.
have the current situation that you have, it creates this theater of the absurd, this politics
Yeah.
of distraction, where you create this sort of
Hmm.
hyper partisan wall between what we have and what we want. There's a difference of opinion, frankly, about the role the government should serve in people's lives. And one group of political thought is that we should have less of a role for government improving the lives of others. And the other side is more along the lines of that government is probably the best tool that exists right now in terms of our political technologies that exist to actually meaningfully improve and embed the lives of others and ameliorate the conditions that exist because government has one form of leverage that virtually all private industry does not, which is that it can solve collective action problems through the use of eminent domain, through economic force, or if need be, through military force. Now, it's not going to use military force to solve problems, but it could. But the whole issue here is that when you carry these huge debts and deficits, while it is true that technically the government could just operate forever, so long as people are willing to buy the debt, right? The whole issue with the debt ceiling is that it's an artificial constraint, meaning that the government is using to limit its spending, but not all countries have debt ceilings. Some countries just keep accruing debt forever. So
Hmm.
long as there's look, so long as people are willing to buy the debt, they could do it forever. It's just the whole problem right now is that you can point to the debt or you can point to the deficits and say, oh, we just don't have enough money to do the things that you want to do, so we're not going to do it. And I disagree completely with that notion that we can't do things that we should be doing, like infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, investing in research. The list goes on and on of things that we should be doing to try to win the future, or to try and at least operate on an equal playing field in the future. Because if we don't make those investments, the country will stagnate. It'll fall behind. Other countries
Hmm.
will outpace us for education, for training, for skills. We'll be driving around in our little commuter trains that go not so fast, while the rest of the world speeds by us on very fast trains, very fast cars, and very fast. The whole point is, I think of it like the space race, right? Remember, Kennedy said we're going to the moon. It wasn't, oh, we don't
Yeah.
have enough money, we can't do it. No, we're going
He
to the moon.
he.
He wasn't looking at the world in terms of a series of cans.
Exactly. If you listen to the speech, the famous speech, we're gonna do it.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen.
Not because it is easy, but because it is hard.
Yeah, we do it because we can, because we must, because the whole point is that we want to progress our understanding of science, technology, etc., so that we can try and survive the frankly difficult
Sure.
issues that are going to happen in the future.
Concerning our evolving understanding of modern monetary theory here, it has served, and you're pointing out that, as the professor points out, that when people say, we can't do it, we don't have the money, we know how the money comes about, so that's incorrect. But what would be correct is we can only do a certain number of things, which might be a function of a percentage of GDP or something, or else we would risk devaluing the currency at some point, we don't know when, so we can't do things if we do not want the currency devaluation, which we do not want. So, if that's true,
I was just going to inject very briefly. I think part of the issue with this conversation is that we too often, for especially politics, they look at the budget or the amount of money available to spend only in terms of a fiscal year, in terms of a window of time with which they have discretionary monies to spend. But the problem
Hmm.
there is that the United States holds a considerable amount of assets wholly independent of any kind of revenue or any kind of issuance of debt bonds. That one way to look at it is that the debt and the deficits are just an operating income for the government, that it's only a fraction of what the government actually has. And the way I think of it is the housing market's valued in the United States at, I think, $140 trillion. There's some exorbitantly high amount of money for the existing housing market in the United States. And that's mainly because of the land and the location and we've talked about how the housing supply is kept in some ways reduced to increase the value of homes. But the
Yeah.
whole point here is that the government has an exorbitant amount of land. I'm not talking about like a tiny amount of land, like an exorbitant amount of land that's not being used to the fullest extent that it could be if the situation really was as dire as they say it is. Because remember, there are other countries that have considerably more people living in those countries with
Hmm.
less
Yeah.
space. So if we really had our backs against the wall and needed money, right,
Yeah.
we could welcome in, I don't know, 100 million people, 200 million
Sure.
people, half a billion people, and just start
Hmm.
renting out huge tracts of land to just do stuff with it. The whole point is that it's an artificial theater of conflict because of political calculations. There's reasons for the theater to exist in the way it does as a facade to make it seem like the situation is worse than it is for political entities in the country to exert their political will, right? It gives them more power. And I know it sucks to say this, that, oh, the sky isn't really falling and the situation isn't as bad as it is, but it's not as bad. It's only bad if the government had nothing at its disposal. But that's not true for the United States. A huge
Hmm.
amount. Anyone who's listening, go look at a map of just how much land
Yeah.
west of the Mississippi or in Alaska is owned outright by the United States. It's paid, right? We paid it. We own it. It's
Yeah.
everyone's, right? If the situation really gets bad, they can use those resources for a very long time.
Yeah.
Alaska is a good example. And this particular case, I think Trump has at least the kernel of a thought that some of
Hmm.
these lands could be used. It's
Yeah.
just that there's a lot of political will to not use them for purposes that are separate from the stability of the U.S. Budget and discretionary income. Mainly,
Hmm.
issues of like the environment or
Right.
conservation, where you apply like a moral lens to the things we have by saying we shouldn't be utilizing those resources to preserve, beauty of nature. Or whatever.
Yeah.
But that whole issue also exists for permitting, and California is a good example where part of the reason they don't have high speed rail is the environmental reviews that they spent like
Yeah.
over a
Mhm.
decade assessing the environmental impact of what happens. And if you spend so
Yeah.
much time contemplating what could be, you fall
Mhm.
behind from what is, right? Like, I don't think that there really was that much time for NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and all those groups for space technology when they're like, we're going to the moon, where they sat around. I mean, if we go to the moon, what's going to happen with the environment and the air and the water and the
Yeah, how much did they really understand how long those chemicals from the launch were going to be in the atmosphere? Who knows? But point is, we went to the moon.
scare the birds? Are we going to
Yeah.
traumatize the local wildlife? Are they're going to be
Yeah.
there are two extremes to this sort of pendulum of you can become paralyzed by inaction
Yeah.
for what seems like a bureaucratic nightmare of, oh, we can't say there's a problem, right? There's a fire and the fire's
Uh-huh.
moving fast and you need to put out the fire with water or some kind of there's a word for it, the foam they use, that
Yeah, fire suppression,
fire retardant
Whatever it is.
fire retardant.
or like a fire extinguisher, the
Yep.
foam. Say there's a problem and the issue is, how do you address the problem? If you sit
Mhm.
there mired in debate, oh, we're gonna hurt this bunny rabbit that's in the way
Yeah.
of the fire, so we can't like drop the water or the retardant. Like at some point, there have to be pragmatic considerations because the fire is on its way. The same kind of lens can be viewed for government inaction. That if you spend too much time stuck in the ways of the past or in a
Mhm.
view of
Mhm.
how things or were before that work, you become essentially behind the times compared to the other countries. And in this regard, I look at healthcare actually is the big one. That the United States is fixated on a system that is not effective at actually addressing the real issues, certain cohorts of the United States population for health problems. And there is a cost to that. If you don't actually help people deal with preventable diseases like cancers, diabetes, certain things, then it does lead to greater expenses in the long term. That if we spent a certain amount of money now to address these issues, we wouldn't have to spend much more money later when those issues become way worse. Anyways, that sorry if I
No, it's fine. That's why it's called Mondays with Mike. You mentioned, or the way I would put what you're getting, if we get in a war, if we get in World War II, money's no object. And it's going to be fine. We got a lot of resources, and we got a lot of land, and we got a lot of people. And frankly, they're underutilized. And if we really wanted to turn it up to 11, we could let in, 100 million, 200 million or so people. There was a book, 1 Billion Americans by Matthew C.S., excuse me. I'll link it in the website. To be continued. Mondays with Mike.